The rain fell in unrelenting sheets, turning the city streets into slick, dark mirrors that fractured the neon glow of signs and the headlights of passing cars. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the cathedral, not to escape the downpour, but to find a sanctuary from the storm raging within me. The world outside was a torrent of noise and water, a chaotic reflection of my own inner state, and the sudden, profound silence that greeted me was like stepping into another realm. It was a silence so deep and ancient that it seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the quiet dripping of my coat onto the cold stone floor as evidence that the world outside still existed. Inside, the air was thick and cool, heavy with the layered sense of history and holiness, the sweet lingering ghost of incense, the faint waxy aroma of 1,000 burnt candles, and the clean, damp smell of ancient stone. Light struggled through the towering stained glass windows, projecting vibrant, trembling mosaics onto the flagstones below. I watched the colored shapes shift and morph with the unseen clouds, painting scenes of martyrdom and ascension that felt both beautiful and accusing. Every detail of the space, from the soaring vaulted ceilings to the cold, unyielding stone, was designed to make one feel small and insignificant before the vastness of God. My footsteps echoed in the immense, empty space as I walked down the central nave, past rows of vacant pews that seemed to wait in patient judgment. The carved faces of saints stared down from their niches in the walls, their painted eyes following me with an unnerving stillness. I felt like an intruder in their sacred silence, my modern anxieties a vulgar stain on the timeless sanctity of the place. I had not come here to pray, as I no longer knew the words, but rather to find a place quiet enough to hear the screaming inside my own head, a place where that sound could finally exhaust itself against walls built to contain centuries of sorrow. My gaze fell upon a dark, ornate confessional, tucked away in a shadowy alcove, almost hidden from view. It was not forgiveness I sought, nor absolution, for I did not believe my feelings were a sin that could be washed away. I was drawn to it by a need for structure, for a place to pour out the formless, suffocating secret I had carried for so long. I needed the anonymity of the screen, the ritual of kneeling in the dark, the presence of a silent listener to act as a vessel for the words I could no longer hold inside. With a sense of grim purpose, I stepped into the cramped wooden box, the door closing behind me with a soft, final click. The darkness inside was absolute, smelling of old wood, dust, and the faint, anxious scent of those who had knelt here before me. I knelt on the worn velvet kneeler, my knees protesting against the hard wood beneath. For a long moment, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my heart against my ribs. Then I heard a soft shuffle from the other side of the screen, followed by the quiet slide of the panel. A silhouette appeared behind the intricate latticework of the grille, a form shrouded in the dark fabric of a habit, indistinct and anonymous. The words came at first as a choked whisper, a confession not of acts committed, but of a fundamental truth of my being. I did not speak of sins of the flesh, for there were none. I spoke of the sin of my heart, of the persistent, unyielding pull I felt toward women, a desire that had shaped the lonely contours of my life. It was a truth I had kept buried under layers of duty and denial for decades, a secret spring that had poisoned every other source of joy. To speak it aloud in this sacred space felt like the ultimate transgression, a defilement of everything the cathedral stood for. My voice grew steadier as the words flowed, describing the quiet ache of watching a woman walk across a room, the way light could catch in strands of her hair, turning it into a halo. I confessed to the silent admiration of the curve of a neck, the delicate strength of a wrist, the depth in a pair of eyes that held a universe of unspoken feeling. I spoke of the forbidden warmth that bloomed in my chest had a shared smile or an accidental touch. It was a litany of beautiful, painful details, an inventory of a lifetime of silent, hopeless longing. When I finished, a profound silence descended upon the small space, heavier and more complete than before. I had laid my soul bare, offering up its most shameful, vulnerable part. I remained on my knees, my head bowed, my hands clenched tightly on the ledge before me. I braced myself for the response I knew must come, the cold, dispassionate voice of judgment, the recitation of scripture, the assignment of a penance designed to scourge the impurity from my soul. I waited for the verdict that would finally confirm what I had always suspected, that I was irrevocably, hopelessly, and utterly alone in my sin. The silence that followed my final word was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on me from the vaulted ceilings of the cathedral. In the cramped darkness of the booth, the air grew thin, and I could hear the frantic drumming of my own blood in my ears. I waited, suspended in a void of my own making, for the inevitable judgment. I pictured the cold, clinical words of condemnation, the prescribed penance, the dismissal that would cast me back out into the rain, now with the added burden of a formerly pronounced sin. This silence felt like a gathering of forces, a quiet moment before the lightning strike of divine disapproval. Then, through the dark latticework of the screen, a movement. It was not a sound, but a pale shape materializing in the gloom. A hand, slender and white, reached out and rested against the grill that separated us. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the harsh verdict I had prepared myself for, that I felt a jolt of pure shock. The fingers were long and delicate, their stillness conveying a profound calm that was utterly at odds with the turmoil in my own soul. It was not a gesture of recoil or rejection, but one of quiet, deliberate connection. My own hand rose as if guided by an external will, a slow, trembling ascent from my lap. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to accept my shame and leave. But some deeper, more ancient impulse compelled me to respond. I pressed my palm flat against the carved wood of the screen, my fingers aligning with the spaces where hers rested on the other side. We were separated by the barrier of the confessional, yet I felt a current pass between us, a spark of recognition that transcended the physical divide. It was a touch without skin, an absolution offered not in words, but in a shared, silent presence. A soft click echoed in the small space as the latch on her side was drawn back. The door to her compartment creaked open, spilling a sliver of the cathedral's dim, colored light into the darkness. She emerged not as a faceless arbiter of faith, but as a woman. Her face, framed by the stark white of a wimple, was younger than I had imagined, her features composed in an expression of serene sorrow. Her eyes, dark and deep, held no judgment, only a vast, unnerving understanding as they met mine. The simple act of her leaving the sanctity of her side of the confessional was a transgression so profound it left me breathless. She took a step toward me, her dark habit whispering against the stone floor. Without a word, she reached for my hand, her cool fingers closing around mine with a gentle but firm grip. The shock of her touch was electric, a grounding force that pulled me from my stunned paralysis. She led me from the shadows of the confessional, out into the open space of the nave, her grip unwavering. I followed, a willing captive, my mind unable to process the surreality of the moment. She was leading me away from the pews in the altar toward a small, heavy door tucked away behind the chancel. The door opened into the sacristy, a room I had never seen before. The air here was different, thick with a sacred, concentrated sense of myrrh, beeswax, and the metallic tang of polished silver. Richly embroidered vestments in deep purples and brilliant golds hung from wooden presses, their threads shimmering in the single beam of light from a high, narrow window. It was a private, holy space, a chamber where the mundane was transformed into the divine, and her bringing me here felt like a crossing of an unbreachable threshold, a violation of the most sacred trust. She released my hand and turned to face me in the center of the room. The silence between us was no longer the empty void of the confessional, but a living, breathing entity charged with unspoken meaning. She raised her hand, not to bless or to admonish, but to gently cup my cheek, her thumb stroking the line of my jaw. Then she leaned in, and her lips met mine. The first kiss was impossibly soft, as chaste and cool as a communion wafer, tasting faintly of blessed wine and something uniquely her own. The kiss lingered for a heart-stopping moment before she pulled back, her eyes searching mine for a sign of resistance. Finding none, she leaned in again, and this time the kiss was different. It was deeper, more searching, a question and an answer all at once. My own lips parted to meet hers, a lifetime of suppressed longing surging to the surface in a wave of disbelief and undeniable want. It was a kiss that shattered every rule, every certainty, every wall I had ever built around my heart. Her hands, which had held mine with such gentle authority, now moved with a new and startling purpose. They slid beneath my damp coat, her fingers tracing the curve of my waist over the thin fabric of my blouse. I felt a tremor run through me as one of her hands moved upward, her touch light and questioning as her fingers found the small pearl buttons at my throat. Slowly, deliberately, she undid the first and then the second, her knuckles brushing against the sensitive skin of my collarbone, sending a cascade of fire through my veins. She broke the kiss only to press her lips to the hollow of my throat, her breath warm against my skin. I tilted my head back in a gesture of pure, instinctual surrender, my eyes closing as her mouth explored the column of my neck and the curve of my shoulder. I was being unmade piece by piece by the hands and lips of a holy woman in the heart of a holy place. My back came up against the hard, unyielding edge of the altar table, the cold wood a stark contrast to the heat flooding my body. My fingers tangled in the heavy wool of her scapular as a sound, half sob and half moan, was muffled against the dark fabric of her shoulder, swallowed by the sacred silence of the room. Our encounters evolved into a secret liturgy, a series of rituals performed in the shadowed corners of the holy house. The great sunlit space of the cathedral, filled with the murmur of parishioners and the scent of day-old incense, became a mere stage for our public roles. During the day, our interactions were fleeting and chaste, a shared glance across the pews during Mass, the brief formal touch of her fingers as she handed me a hymnal. These moments were charged with an almost unbearable tension, a silent acknowledgement of the hidden world that awoke for us only after the heavy doors were bolted for the night. The church after midnight was a different entity entirely. It was our private kingdom, a vast and silent landscape of shadow and stone. The vibrant saints in the stained glass windows became dark, empty silhouettes against the moonlit sky, and the statues of angels and martyrs seemed to watch us with a new conspiratorial stillness. We learned the geography of its darkness, the creak of a specific floorboard, the way a draft would whisper down a forgotten corridor. Every night was a rediscovery of this sacred space, a reconsecration of it as our own, a temple dedicated not to a distant God, but to the tangible, breathing truth of our shared desire. Our sanctuary was not one place, but many. We found each other in the echoing confines of the bell tower, where the sleeping city spread out below us like a blanket of scattered jewels, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the heat between our bodies. We lay together in the choir loft, surrounded by silent organ pipes that seemed to hold their breath as we moved. We kissed in the dusty ambulatories behind the main altar, our whispers lost among the tombs of long-dead bishops. Each location was a new verse in our forbidden psalm, an exploration of the boundaries of both the sacred space and our own passion. One night, she led me to a place I had never been, down a narrow, winding set of stone stairs behind the altar. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of incense and wax replaced by the raw, subterranean smell of damp earth and ancient stone. The silence here was different, heavier and more profound, a viscous silence that felt as though it had been undisturbed for centuries. She was leading me down into the crypt, into the very foundation of the cathedral, a place of rest for the most revered of the church's dead. The transgression of it sent a thrill of fear and exhilaration through me. She lit a single, thick candle, and the space was revealed in a flickering, buttery light. The crypt was a small, vaulted chamber lined with stone sarcophagi, their lids carved with the effigies of sleeping prelates. The candlelight threw our shadows against the walls, making them dance and writhe, monstrous and distorted figures in the hallowed hall of the dead. It felt as though we were the only living things in a world of sleeping stone, our warmth and our breathing a sacrilege in the face of their eternal, cold repose. This was the holiest and most forbidden part of the church, and she had brought me here. She turned to me in the center of the chamber, her face a mask of shadow and light. Slowly, deliberately, she began to unfasten the closures of her habit. The heavy black wool fell away, pooling at her feet on the stone floor, revealing the simpler brown tunic beneath. Then came the most startling revelation, a coarse, woven hair shirt, which she unlaced and let fall. I saw the faint red marks it had left on her pale skin, a testament to her daily penance, and my heart ached with a feeling I could not name. Finally, she stood before me in only a thin, white linen shift, a vulnerable ghost in the flickering candlelight. I reached out and touched the marks on her shoulders and waist, my fingers tracing the patterns of her piety. Her skin, which I had imagined would be as cool as the stone around us, was warm and alive beneath my hands. It smelled of simple soap and starch, a clean and human scent in this place of decay and preservation. I kissed the marks, an act that felt like both a blasphemy and a blessing, erasing her penance with my profane affection. I was worshiping at the altar of her body, discovering the sacred text of her skin in the heart of a tomb. She led me to the largest sarcophagus in the center of the room and lay back upon its cold, flat lid. The stone was shockingly cold against my own skin as I lay down beside her, the chill seeping into my bones even as the heat of her body warmed my side. We made love there, in the absolute silence of the crypt, our movements slow and reverent, as if we were performing a rite that was older than the church itself. Our soft breaths were the only sounds, our joined bodies the only prayer, in the profound and watchful quiet of the dead. I felt the history of the place seeping into me, the weight of centuries pressing down from the vaulted ceiling. Yet in her arms, I felt weightless, timeless. The contrast between the cold, unyielding stone beneath me and the soft, yielding warmth of her skin was the most intense sensation I had ever known. It was a union of opposites, of life and death, of the profane and the divine. The climax, when it came, was not a shout, but a silent, internal shattering, a moment of violent grace that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient stones around us. Afterward, we lay entwined on the cold slab, the candle burning low beside us. The silence returned, but it was different now, filled with the echo of what we had done. It was no longer an empty silence, but one that held our secret, protecting it within the heart of the stone. As she led me back up the winding stairs and into the familiar shadows of the nave, I felt irrevocably changed. I had descended into the tomb as a sinner, seeking solace, and had emerged as a heretic, discovering a new and terrible form of prayer, a worship conducted not with words, but with the silent, knowing language of the flesh. Our most sacred encounter unfolded in a place far removed from the public grandeur of the cathedral, in the absolute privacy of her monastic cell. She led me there late one night, through a labyrinth of silent, stone-flagged corridors in the convent wing, a part of the complex I had never seen. The air here was different, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax and laundered linen, a place of quiet discipline and communal life. Each heavy door she unlocked with a plain iron key felt like another layer of an oath being broken, another step into the forbidden heart of her world. The profound silence of the cloister, inhabited by her sleeping sisters, made our soft footsteps feel like a deafening intrusion. Her cell was a small, Spartan room, a perfect cube of white-plastered walls and austere simplicity. A narrow wooden bed, little more than a cot, was pressed against one wall, its thin mattress covered by a single coarse blanket. A small, dark crucifix hung above it, the only adornment in the entire space. Beside the bed stood a simple wooden nightstand holding a leather-bound Bible and a small unlit candle. The room was a testament to a life stripped bare of all worldly comfort, a space designed for devotion and self-denial, and our presence there together felt like the ultimate profanity, a whispered rebellion in the very citadel of faith. In this stark and holy space, she began to undress, not with the reverent slowness of the crypt, but with a quiet, almost shy deliberateness. She removed her heavy outer habit and folded it neatly, placing it on the single wooden chair. She unlaced the tunic and the hair shirt, her movements practiced and efficient, a nightly ritual now imbued with a new and sacred significance. Finally, she stood before me in only her thin white cotton shift, her body a pale, luminous silhouette against the deep shadows of the room. The moonlight slanting through the high barred window was our only illumination. She lay down on the narrow bed and held her arms out to me, an invitation that was both a plea and a command. I went to her, my own clothes feeling heavy and foreign in the ascetic purity of the room. I shed them quickly, letting them fall in a heap on the cold stone floor, a small pile of worldly clutter in her immaculate space. I lay down beside her on the cot, the mattress groaning softly under our combined weight. The space was so small that our bodies were pressed together from shoulder to ankle, our shared warmth a small pocket of life in the cool, still air of the cell. For a long time, we did not move. We simply lay there, face to face, breathing in the quiet intimacy of the moment. I looked at her in the pale moonlight, seeing not the serene and distant nun from the altar, but the woman. I saw the faint tracery of lines around her eyes, the small, almost invisible scar on her chin, the pulse beating a soft, steady rhythm in the hollow of her throat. I reached out and traced the line of her collarbone, my fingers memorizing the delicate architecture of her body, a geography I was only just beginning to explore. Her hands, in turn, explored me with a tender and reverent curiosity. She touched my face, her calloused fingertips brushing against my cheek, her thumb gently tracing the line of my lips. She ran her hands through my hair, her fingers catching for a moment on the strands of silver at my temples, a silent acknowledgement of the years that separated us. It was a touch that held no passion, only a profound and overwhelming tenderness, a quiet act of worship that spoke more than any prayer. In that moment, under the watchful gaze of the crucifix on the wall, our love felt not sinful, but sanctified. The passion that followed was not the fierce, desperate coupling of the crypt, but something slower, deeper, more intensely intimate. It was an unhurried exploration, a silent dialogue between our bodies. Her lips found mine in the darkness, and the kiss was one of profound recognition, a homecoming. Every touch was deliberate, every caress a word in a language only we understood. There was no sense of transgression here, no feeling of stolen pleasure. In the absolute privacy of her cell, we were not a sinner and a nun, but simply two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of places. She moved over me, her body light and graceful in the dim light. I watched her face as she looked down at me, her expression one of intense concentration, as if she were committing every detail of me to memory. When she entered me, it was a slow, deliberate joining, a seamless merging of two into one. We moved together with a natural, unhurried rhythm, our bodies perfectly attuned to each other's needs. The pleasure built slowly, a deep, rising tide that started in the core of my being and spread outwards until every nerve ending was alight with a quiet, ecstatic fire. The release was not a tempest, but a quiet, profound unfolding, a moment of such intense connection that it felt as if our very souls had touched. It was a silent, internal blossoming, a moment of grace that left me trembling and breathless in her arms. In the aftermath, we clung to each other, our bodies damp, our breathing slowly returning to normal. The crucifix on the wall seemed to gaze down upon us, not with condemnation, but with a silent, compassionate understanding. We were two broken pieces of a whole, and here, in this small, bare room, we had finally found a way to fit together. We lay there for hours, wrapped in the coarse blanket and each other's arms, as the moon traced its slow path across the sky. Sleep was impossible, a needless interruption to the quiet miracle of the night. I felt a sense of peace I had not known was possible, a deep and abiding calm that settled over me like a benediction. The guilt and shame I had carried for so long had been burned away in the quiet crucible of her cell, replaced by a simple, unshakable truth. This was not a sin. It was the purest, most holy thing I had ever known. My life, once a predictable, monochrome landscape of quiet desperation, had been irrevocably transformed. The world outside the cathedral walls became a mere prelude, a gray and muted existence I endured between our clandestine meetings. My days were now measured not in hours, but in the slow, agonizing crawl of time until I could be with her again. The secret we shared was a constant, warm hum beneath the surface of my skin, a hidden sun that illuminated my world from the inside out, making the ordinary feel pale and insubstantial by comparison. I began to see her not just as the object of my desire, but as a person, a woman composed of 1,000 small, captivating details. I memorized the tiny, almost invisible freckle just above her lip, the way a crease would appear between her brows when she was lost in thought during a sermon, the slight, almost imperceptible limp she had on rainy days. She once whispered to me the story of a childhood fall from a bicycle that had left a faint, silvery scar on her knee, And this small earthly imperfection made her infinitely more real and more precious to me. These were the details that composed the true geography of the woman I loved, a map I was slowly, painstakingly charting in my heart. One evening, I arrived at her cell at our prearranged time, my heart beating with its now familiar rhythm of anticipation and nervous joy. I slipped through the darkened corridors of the convent, a ghost in a place I did not belong, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cold stone. But when I reached her door, I found it slightly ajar, a sliver of candlelight flickering from within. I pushed it open gently, expecting to find her waiting for me, but the small room was empty. The single candle on her nightstand cast long, dancing shadows on the bare walls, making the space feel lonely and expectant. A strange disquiet settled over me as I stood in the empty room. Her absence was a palpable void, a sudden silence in the music that had become my life. I told myself she had simply been delayed, perhaps called away by the abbess, or detained by some unforeseen duty. I sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the coarse blanket rough beneath my fingers, and waited. The minutes stretched into an hour, and with each passing tick of the grandfather clock in the distant refectory, my unease grew into a cold knot of dread in the pit of my stomach. It was a sudden, illicit curiosity that finally propelled me to my feet, a desperate need to find some tangible piece of her in this sterile, impersonal room. I moved to the small wooden nightstand, the single piece of furniture that held any evidence of her personal life. My eyes fell upon the small, closed drawer beneath the Bible. I knew it was a violation, a trespass into a privacy that was not mine to take, but the urge to know her more completely, to uncover some hidden facet of the woman who had consumed my world, was too powerful to resist. My hand trembled as I reached out and slowly, guiltily pulled the drawer open. Inside, beneath a neatly folded stack of white linen handkerchiefs, lay a small, flat object wrapped in a piece of faded yellow silk. The fabric was old and soft, worn thin with time and handling. My fingers fumbled with the knot, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. I felt like an archaeologist unearthing a sacred relic, a sense of profound transgression warring with an insatiable need to know. The silk fell away, revealing not a rosary or a holy medal, but several folded yellow documents and a single small dog-eared photograph. A cold wave washed over me as I picked up the photograph. The image was faded, the colors muted by time, but the faces were shockingly, horribly clear. It was a picture of me, taken more than 2 decades ago, my face young and impossibly weary, a frightened, hollow-eyed girl of 20 staring out from the past. In my arms, I held a swaddled infant, a tiny, red-faced creature wrapped in a standard-issue hospital blanket. I remembered the exact moment the photo was taken, the sterile smell of the nursery, the detached kindness of the nurse who had snapped the picture for a keepsake before taking my daughter away forever. My hands shook so violently that the other documents fluttered to the floor. I knelt to pick them up, my movements stiff and robotic, my mind a screaming void. They were official-looking papers, brittle with age. Adoption records. My name was there, clearly printed in the space marked biological mother. And below it, the name and birth date of the child I had surrendered. The date matched the one seared into my memory, the worst day of my life, the day I had committed the one sin for which I had never sought and never expected to be forgiven. My heart did not so much break as it simply ceased to function. The air turned to solid glass in my lungs, and the world narrowed to the brittle, yellowed paper in my hands. The young, terrified face in the photograph was a ghost from a life I had tried to bury, a specter of a girl who had made an impossible choice in a sterile, lonely room. The documents were the verdict, the official record of my greatest failure and deepest shame. I knelt on the cold stone floor of the cell, trapped in a sudden, silent vortex where the past had violently collided with the present, shattering both beyond recognition. The soft, deliberate click of the door latch was a sound that seemed to travel from a great distance. Time stretched and thinned, and I watched as if in a slow, waking nightmare as the door swung inward. She stood on the threshold, a serene figure framed by the deep shadows of the convent corridor. Her eyes, accustomed to the darkness, immediately found me on the floor, a crumpled figure surrounded by the scattered evidence of my past. She saw the photograph, the papers, and the truth that now lay exposed between us on the cold stones. My gaze lifted from the ghost in my hands to the woman in the doorway. I searched her face for shock, for confusion, for the dawning horror that was consuming me, but I found none. Her expression was one of absolute, unnerving placidity. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a profound and bottomless sorrow, mingled with something else, something chillingly like triumph. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment for a very, very long time. And then, for the first time, I truly saw her. It was as if a veil had been ripped from my eyes, and I was seeing not the face of a lover, but the geography of my own bloodline. I saw the familiar curve of her brow, the exact shape of my own mouth, the way she held her head at a slight angle when she was listening. The recognition was a physical blow, a visceral impact that stole what little breath I had left. This was not just a woman. This was my daughter, the daughter I had abandoned. The full, monstrous weight of our intimacy crashed down upon me. The past weeks replayed in my mind, but the film was now hideously warped, its colors twisted into a grotesque parody of what I had believed them to be. The confession I had poured out in the darkness of the booth was not a plea for solace. It had been an unwitting indictment, a testimony delivered directly to my judge and jury. Her silent absolution was not an act of grace, but the beginning of a sentence. Every sacred moment, every tender caress in the shadows of the cathedral was now a brand of an unspeakable, unimaginable profanity. This was not a tragedy of circumstance, a cruel twist of fate that had brought us together. The realization settled into my bones with the cold certainty of death. This was an act of meticulous, patient design. She had known. From the very first moment I knelt in her confessional, she had known exactly who I was. The seduction, the shared secrets, the illusion of a sacred, forbidden love, it had all been a lie, an intricate and terrible performance orchestrated for an audience of one. Her piety was not a shield, it had been a weapon. The photograph slipped from my nerveless fingers, the small square of paper fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. It landed face up between us, a silent, grinning testament to our shared and shattered history. She did not move from the doorway. She did not speak. Her silence was more damning than any accusation, more terrifying than any scream. It was a calm, absolute confirmation of the horror I was just beginning to comprehend, the silence of a predator whose trap had finally, perfectly sprung. As I knelt there, paralyzed at the center of the ruins of my life, the final, devastating truth took root in my soul. The bond we had forged was not born of love or even of lust. It was an act of reclamation, a twisted form of justice, a daughter claiming her mother through the absolute desecration of her body and spirit. What had passed between us in the sanctity of that church was not a sin born of passion. It was a judgment, meticulously executed, and far more terrible than any damnation I could have ever conceived.